Welcome to Municipal Affairs Year in Review. We're reflecting on a year that has been as challenging as transformative for municipalities across this great nation. This past year, our cities, towns, villages, and rural communities have been at the forefront of some of the most pressing issues of our time. From navigating the financial ripple effects of economic uncertainty to embracing innovation in infrastructure and housing. All the while, local governments have proven that they are more than just the closest to the people. They are the problem solvers, the innovators, and often the ones who make things happen when higher levels of government fall short. And joining me for our final episode of 2024 and to look back on the last 12 months and to the future is the president of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Rebecca Bligh. Rebecca, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about the last 12 months in municipalities across Canada and looking towards 2025 for the future of municipalities. And I want to start by asking a simple question. How would you describe the state of municipalities at the end of 2024?
Well, I think that it's been a very full year for municipalities. There's been a number of pressures, challenges that municipalities have faced across the board, related to broader issues, housing, rate of inflation, economic, the state of the economy, and things like that just put this downward pressure on municipalities. So certainly there's a sense of frustration and urgency around municipalities being supported within their current structure, if you will, in order to serve and continue to meet the needs of their residents, of Canadians across the country. So I'd say there's probably a little bit of frustration, and we like to stay positive and optimistic here to look towards that future state. I think what it's done is really help us put a real fine point on what those priorities are for municipalities from a advocacy and FCM perspective, so that we can seek solutions in a collaborative way. So while there might be some frustrations, there is hope looking forward that it's going to have us even stronger as municipalities face some of these challenges head on.
We are recording this interview about a week and a half after the Advocacy Days FCM held in Ottawa, where your board of directors came together with municipal leaders from across Canada. What was the overarching theme that you heard from municipal leaders looking back on 2024? Because when I speak to them, I hear about infrastructure challenges, property taxes, funding, affordability. What did you hear during those advocacy days?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly what you stated. There are some real common threads in terms of those pressures that we're talking about that drew almost entirely our board to Ottawa for those days. We had 90 meetings with ministers organized in order to send our message, which is to say, our municipal finance structure is out of date. We need greater flexibility in how we are funding municipal budgets, and those infrastructure deficits, growing economies end up requiring new and more resources in order to be able to meet the needs of those larger populations. And we forget about, because you know what, they're always there, the community centers, the rec centers, the roads get plowed, the garbage gets picked up, the sewers get laid. And we're at a really interesting time in our country where many of our municipalities are sort of crossing that 50, 60, 70-year mark. And a lot of that infrastructure needs renewal. And so those were some of those conversations we were having, is how do we meet the needs of Canadians collectively, being, at ground zero, if you will, in Ottawa that week. Yeah.
Did you hear from the Prime Minister? Because I know the Prime Minister spoke to the delegates, the Minister of Housing, Sean Fraser, Scott Aitchison, the housing critic for the Conservative Party, all spoke. Did you hear that they understand where municipalities are at the end of 2024?
Yes, I mean, we've had and continue to have great conversations and turnout from from the federal government, both sort of formal opposition parties as well as government itself. Uh, in terms of the elected majority party coming to FCM over the years. So we continue to have that same interest, which we were really pleased with during those days. Yeah, I would say that Minister Fraser said a couple of interesting points that are not inconsistent across political parties, which is infrastructure tied to housing. And so we recognize that, and yet we also know that there's a interest to reduce red tape, to make these programs less complicated, and to get that money out the door as quick as possible and reduce the bureaucracy around that. So whether it's a rural community or an urban, larger city, the needs for housing are there, except at a different scale. So the infrastructure dollars need to respond to those needs, I should say. So we were very happy to have the Prime Minister come and address our delegation. We had a very well-attended event in the evening with MPs from every political party right across the Hill, which was great. And so we feel like our message was heard loud and clear, and it was positive for us that there's a recognition that our country is growing and the infrastructure needs are increasing, and municipalities need better ways to fund those services and renewal.
Talking about infrastructure, in Aurora, Ontario, earlier this month in December of 2024, the federal Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, says he does not back a move to boost infrastructure funding to municipalities. And I'm going to quote him here for a second before I ask you the question. He said, is quoted as saying, quote, "Municipal governments, don't let them bullshit you, are bursting with cash and they're wasting it all," end quote. He said this in an interview with Aurora Times. So I've got to ask you, as the president of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Rebecca, are municipalities wasting the infrastructure money that they're getting from the federal and provincial governments?
Municipalities are probably the most fiscally responsible level of government because we have to be. We actually we can't have debts like other levels of government by virtue of local government acts, community charters, whatever you want to call it. So the idea that we're sitting on pots of cash is I'd say a misunderstanding, which I'm surprised, to hear, and I trust that that's not a point of confusion from the leader of the opposition. But I think it's surprising often to residents that municipalities actually cannot borrow money for operating. We cannot go over in our budgets. And so we are pretty constrained to manage our operating and plan for our capital investments in a fairly technical and precise way. So the reserves, that municipalities may hang on to, well, look, we just went through a pandemic. I can tell you that there are municipalities in other countries that went bankrupt as a result. And so not in our country, but in other countries, because of the unexpected global pandemic and the extent to which that impacted people. But at the end of the day, we are responding to a homelessness crisis. We are responding to unexpected severe weather events. We are adapting our communities to manage floodplains, and we're doing all of this with the budgets that we have. So I would expect that municipalities having a certain percentage of their operating in a reserve fund would be considered the fiscally responsible thing to do. And it's not as interesting in the headlines, but it is actually the way things work.
How much of that responsibility is a dereliction of responsibilities from those provincial and federal counterparts? Because when I speak to municipal leaders from across Canada this year, I heard that they're facing more provincial and federal issues at the municipal level, and that's cutting into their operating and capital budget. Are you finding when you speak to municipal leaders across Canada that what's happening in Vancouver, where you're from, is same thing that's happening in St. John's. It's that downloading or offloading of responsibilities to the municipal governments because the province and the federal government just say, you do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, residents in our country just are tired of governments pointing fingers at one another. That is for sure. So that's not how we're going to solve any of these major challenges. Where we recognize, particularly at the municipal level, that we are the frontline services of the residents of our country. Because when no one else does it, we have to respond oftentimes in a more expensive way. And I think homelessness is a perfect example of that. And certainly, as you mentioned, I'm from Vancouver. So we have had significant encampments and things like that that are related to a lack of affordable housing, a lack of housing generally. Um, and with that comes increased supports for mental health, increased sanitation, increased warming centers in our community centers and libraries, opening hours that we would not normally have budgeted to be open in order to provide safe and indoor warm spaces for people to come in out of the cold. That's what municipalities respond to and even have to react to every single day to make sure that people are cared for while also knocking on the door of provincial and federal governments to say we need long-term solutions here to make sure that we're not in this reaction and sort of cycle of ways that our people in our communities are struggling. And I mentioned homelessness, but we know we are dealing with a mental health crisis that plays out on our streets every day. We have increased concerns across the country around public safety, making sure that folks are reintegrated and into community in positive ways that help them restore back to whatever they need to in terms of work, employment, housing, things like that. And in a growing country and a growing population, those needs are only going to increase. And that's really why we continue to advocate for a new framework to fund municipal budgets that is responsive to those current day contexts that I just outlined as just a few of the examples.
How are those conversations going about getting that trilateral agreement, conversation, I should say, to start it? Because I've asked Premier Moe, and he said he's willing to have that conversation if the conversation exists. I've asked Premier Boab Canoe, and he says if there's a conversation, he wants to be added. I'm planning to be up in the Yukon and the Yellowknife early in 2025, so I'll be asking the premiers of those two territories from a national perspective, are you hearing that people want to have this conversation? It's just someone needs to say, let's go to the table.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, of course, a lot has happened since advocacy days, and that was only like a week and a half ago. So, regardless of where things go with the federal government, we are a nonpartisan organization, and our mandate does not change. And we have heard resounding support from our membership that the municipal growth framework is the correct target for our advocacy. So we're going to focus there. Does that mean that we need, in this very large, beautiful country we live in, every premier at the table at the same time with the federal government? That feels like quite an effort to move forward and achieve. And yet you've already named a number of different premiers who recognize that this is a challenge and that they want to be at the table to renegotiate or negotiate, which of course has to be I have to be very clear, does not mean increasing taxes. This doesn't mean a new tax. This means a fairer and more equitable distribution of taxes. And so bringing it back, I have a lot of time dedicated to building those relationships with our provincial associations and plan to continue that in the coming years, president of FCM. And we will make sure that some of those conversations are, of course, prioritized with those premiers that are ready to sit at those tables and get into those conversations. And I hold great faith that others will come along in time as well. And of course, this coming year will be critical to the success of that effort. And as I say, our mandate doesn't change. We remain very focused on that as a goal.
Before we talk about 2025, I have one area I want to just touch on quickly because it seems to be popping up a lot more in the conversations I'm having, and that is the abuse directed towards elected officials at the municipal level. Earlier this month, we had one counselor here in Alberta resign because they were sick. They were diagnosed with cancer. I'm not saying anything out of turns, and residents were upset that the cancer diagnosis was getting in their way. In Northern Ontario, in Kenora, a counselor's parents' home address was posted on social media for them to go and protest at because they were upset with what was going on. And just recently, I had a conversation with a Reeve, and a person showed up to their house, entered their house without any knowledge, and asked their children to show where their mother was so they could go confront the mother.
Wow.
Abuse is on the rise in Canada towards municipal officials. What does FCM do in the short term to help address these issues so we don't have what we saw in England a few years ago happen where a local official died because someone brought a gun?
Yeah, yeah. It is a really disheartening but critical issue to raise. And so appreciate you doing that because one of the roles that we do play at FCM is ensuring that we are daylighting the seriousness of what you're describing, the level of hostility, abuse, and entitlement to what you're describing is increased, of course, since the pandemic. But I think just the nature of some of our social media platforms has really shifted the discourse away from respectful disagreement and engagement to personal attacks and the like. And we see really good people who are elected to municipal office choosing to either step down midterm or not run again. We worked very hard to increase parity on city councils across the country, increasing women's participation in local government to sort of a 30% standard across the board, which is still obviously like parity would mean more than that. But what we found is that while that work was fruitful and that there were more women interested in running for local government, it was unlikely that they would run again based on the level of vitriol and attack, personal attack, and risks to families and in their communities and what have you. And you mentioned somebody posting an address. I actually had my home doxed based on a decision around a a supportive housing development in my neighborhood, of which I lived as well. And it was very unsettling. The police had to be involved. So I know firsthand what it feels like, that level of violation. And it just happens in a second. So I think we have to increase accountability. We have to push for stricter regulations around some of these social media platforms. There are ways that these social networks and social media platforms can regulate for some of this, and I don't think they're doing enough. And so our job is to ensure that we are backing up those local government folks who are victimized by this level of really, at the end of the day, it's violence, and it needs to be responded to. And I encourage anyone that has had to deal with this to file a report to make sure that the police are involved, because the escalation, to your point, we needs to be mitigated for if that were to happen. So.
I want to
Yeah.
turn to FCM as a whole now. We are heading into a very big season here in Canada.
Mhm.
There is a scheduled federal election. It may be called in the spring, it may be called hypothetically in the fall. Who knows when might be called. But what are you, as president of FCM, and what is the organization looking to hear from the leaders heading into that next federal election, whenever it may be?
Mhm. Yeah, and thank you. It is a very exciting year ahead. And we have a fantastic team at FCM that has their finger on the button, as it were, ready to respond. We are paying attention as a nonpartisan organization. We are excited to see all party platforms and particularly focusing on where they will move the needle around housing and infrastructure, what their plans are to address homelessness and the increasing lack of affordable housing as a part of that housing plan. And then, of course, goes without saying, an appetite for the municipal growth framework. That would be great to see in party platforms, of course. But we have an incredible election readiness plan. We have been through this before. We're no stranger to a federal election as an organization. And so we are going to be focused with keen interest in the coming weeks and months in terms of what those party platforms are that align with the needs of our membership.
How does FCM support and advocate for such a diverse group of members that you have? You have from the most rural community here in Alberta to the largest city of Vancouver and Toronto. You, as the national organization, have to address rural and urban needs. How do you see yourself working across those rural urban divides and becoming just that municipal voice for all municipalities, to whether wherever they are?
Yeah, well, data matters. So we have spent the last 6 months finding out what that data shows us in terms of those common threads through all municipalities. And we actually had a higher response for our rural members in a poll that we Abacus Data had executed for us and have reported back on the findings. And what we found, or what they found through this poll, extensive poll, was that housing affordability, um, cost of living generally, public safety, and the increase in homelessness across the country, no matter what size of the municipality or local government. And I like to use both because not all communities are a municipality, right? Some are local governments.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and so that gave us the data that we needed to know that by focusing on those 4 to 5 key priorities is going to be representative of every member we have, coast to coast to coast, rural, urban, and every community in between. And personally, my commitment, of course, is to be on the ground in those communities as president of FCM in the coming year. I think more important this year than any year, really, as we head into a federal election, so that they can feel and know for certain that their concerns and priorities have been heard directly and will be reflected in how we take our work forward into 2025.
Well, it sounds like you and I are probably going to see a lot of each other in
I was
2025 because I'm
We
probably
should,
going to be doing the
you
same thing.
might actually talk more miles than me. I don't know. We should have a little check-in next year and see how we did.
Before I let you go, I have one final question because 2025, like you said, is going to be a busy year from FCM, from local elections here in Alberta, from Newfoundland and Labrador. They're heading to local elections as well. We have a federal election on the horizon. We have provincial elections on the horizon as well. What's your outlook for 2025 for municipalities?
Um, I think that municipalities have felt a little dumped on in the last year and a half. My outlook for 2025 for municipalities is that they are going to be seen as critical partners in reaching Canadians. through other levels of government. And an example of that is what we just talked about, the housing, public safety, right? The homelessness, cost of living. These are priorities from other orders of government, and they are enabled by municipalities. So we are going to have to work together. We want to work together collaboratively with other orders of government to be able to seek those solutions. And I am confident that we are seen as partners in that conversation, and we'll be the ones to show that as municipalities. So that's the outlook. We have a lot of work to do. We can't sort of what I like to say, Pollyanna positivity, like we can't put blinders on and just say everything's going to be fine. We actually have to believe that we can move the needle for municipalities so that those funding streams can be established, that infrastructure funding can be delivered as committed to already in past federal budgets, that we're getting money out the door into our communities so that they can feel like they're able to make good on their promises to their residents and their communities. So hopefully optimistic, cautiously optimistic and hopeful. And it's going to take a lot of work, and we're ready to do it.
I've done now 10 of these year in reviews of 2024, and every single president of your provincial organizations or territorials have all said optimistic for 2025. So let's hope that optimism turns into success at the end of 2025. Rebecca, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for sitting down with me for my last episode of 2024. Looking forward to seeing you on the road and in Ottawa in 2025.
Yes, likewise. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was really good to sit down with you today.
Thank you so much for tuning in for our final episode of 2024. Looking back on the last 12 months, we could not have done this without you, and we appreciate everyone who has taken time out of their busy schedule, to our guests, to our viewers, to our listeners who have made this show possible. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being engaged. So until January 13th, stay informed, stay engaged, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and we'll see you in 2025. Till then, everyone.